My son called me at 6 in the morning and said Mom died last night. He said the funeral is this Friday. He said Dad inherited everything legally, but since I am losing my mind, he is taking control of all the assets. He said I would get nothing but a bed in a state facility. I just held the phone and smiled, because Mom was standing right next to me, holding a plate of fresh pancakes. Before I tell you how my own flesh and blood tried to bury a woman who is still very much alive, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been underestimated by the very people you sacrificed your life to raise. My name is Garrett Stone. For 42 years, I ran Stone General Contracting in Seattle. I built half the skyline of that rainy city with these two hands. I poured concrete until my back gave out, and I negotiated contracts until my voice went raspy. I did it all to build a net worth of $5.2 million, so my family would never know the hunger I knew as a child. I thought I was building a legacy. Turns out, I was just fattening up a shark. It was a Tuesday morning on Flathead Lake in Montana. The water was like a sheet of glass reflecting the snow-capped peaks of the Mission Mountains. I was sitting in a folding chair next to my $150,000 Winnebago RV. This vehicle was the first thing I ever bought just for myself. After 4 decades of driving beat-up pickup trucks and investing every spare cent into the business or into my son Preston's endless failures, this RV was my freedom. I had a fishing line in the water, but I wasn't really fishing. I was just breathing. For the first time in years, the knot of anxiety in my chest was loosening. Beatrice and I had been on the road for 3 months. We told no one. We just packed up and drove north, leaving behind the gray skies of Seattle and the suffocating pressure of our son's constant demands for money. Then my phone vibrated on the folding table. The screen flashed the name Preston. My stomach tightened. It was the same reaction I had when the IRS audited my company in '98, or when the bank called to say my business loan was overdue. My son Preston is 42 years old. He is a man who wears $3,000 Italian suits, but somehow cannot pay his own mortgage. I paid for his college degree in business, which he never used. I paid off his $48,000 gambling debt when he was 25 because he was crying on my kitchen floor, promising he would change. I paid for his wedding to Tiffany, a woman who looks at me like I am a stain on her designer rug. I debated letting it go to voicemail. But the father in me, the foolish old man who still remembers teaching him to ride a bike, picked it up. "Garrett, here," I said. My voice was rough from the morning coffee. There was no hello. No "how are you, Dad?" "Dad, listen to me carefully." Preston's voice was sharp. It was his business voice, the one he uses when he is trying to sell a house he knows has termite damage. "I am listening," I said. "It is Mom," he said. I froze. Not because I was scared, but because I was confused. Beatrice was inside the RV humming along to a Patsy Cline song while she cooked breakfast. "What about her?" I asked. "She is gone, Dad," Preston said. I sat very still. The fishing rod twitched in my hand. "Gone where?" I asked, playing along. "She passed away last night, Dad. Massive coronary. It happened at Sunny Meadows around 2 in the morning. The doctors said it was quick. She didn't suffer." Sunny Meadows. That was the assisted living facility Preston had insisted we move into last year. He called it a luxury retirement community. I called it a warehouse for old people waiting to die. It smelled like bleach and despair. We stayed there exactly 2 weeks before I looked at Beatrice and said, "Let's get out of here." We moved out 3 months ago, but we never told Preston. We wanted to see if he would even visit. He hadn't. Not once. I took a slow breath. "Are you sure, Preston?" "I am at the facility right now, Dad," he lied. The lie came out of his mouth as easily as breathing. "I just identified the body. It is her. Look, I know this is a shock. You are confused. Mr. Harrington, the lawyer, he agrees with me. Your dementia is getting worse. You probably don't even remember me visiting you last week, do you? I let the silence hang in the air. I have never been diagnosed with dementia. My mind is as sharp as the day I outbid 3 competitors for the downtown stadium contract. But Preston needed me to be senile. If I was senile, the power of attorney he tricked me into signing last year would activate. I don't remember that I said, making my voice sound shaky. Exactly. Preston sighed. Look, Dad. I have made an executive decision. I authorized the cremation immediately. Due to the infectious disease protocols at the home, we couldn't wait. She is already being processed. He was cremating his mother. Without me. Without a goodbye. Because a body is evidence and ashes are just dust. He was trying to erase her before I could even ask a question. That seems very fast, son, I said. It is for the best, Dad. The funeral is Friday. We are holding it at the big chapel in Seattle, the one near the country club. And Dad, listen to me. Do not come. Excuse me, I asked. The anger was starting to boil in my gut, hot and heavy like molten tar. You are not well, Preston said. You will make a scene. Tiffany and I will handle the service. We will accept the condolences. You stay there in wherever you think you are. I have already contacted the bank. We are freezing the joint accounts to protect the assets from your condition. I will manage the estate now. The life insurance policy pays out $1.5 million, and with the house sale we should be able to get you into a nice state facility. One that is more affordable. So that was it. The end game. It wasn't just about the $1.5 million life insurance policy. It was the house, my house, the house I built with my own crew in 1985. The house that sits on 2 acres of prime Seattle real estate, now worth nearly $3 million. He wanted to sell it. He needed the cash. You are selling the house, I asked. It is too big for you. Preston snapped. You are alone now, Dad. Mom is dead. You need to face reality. You are an old man with no wife and no mind left. Let me take care of the money. I am your son. I know what is best. He paused, waiting for me to break, waiting for me to cry or beg or fall apart like the weak old man he desperately wanted me to be. I looked out at the lake. A bald eagle was circling overhead, hunting for prey. It looked free. I felt free too. The freedom that comes when you finally realize you don't have to protect someone anymore because they just tried to stab you in the heart. Okay, Preston, I said softly. You handle it. You handle everything. Good choice, Dad. I will send you the paperwork for the facility. Goodbye. The line went dead. I put the phone down on the table. My hand was steady. I reeled in my fishing line, calmly hooking the lure onto the eyelet. I stood up and stretched, feeling the pop in my old knees. The door to the RV opened. Beatrice stepped out. She was wearing her favorite floral apron, the one with the sunflower stains. She was 70 years old, but to me she was still the most beautiful woman in the world. She was holding 2 plates of eggs and pancakes. Who is that on the phone, Garrett? She asked, setting the plates down. I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had bandaged my cuts when I was a young laborer. The woman who pinched pennies so we could buy our first excavator. The woman who had stood by me when we had nothing and when we had everything. That was our son, I said, taking a plate. Oh, Beatrice smiled. Did he wish us a happy anniversary? Not exactly, I said, picking up my fork. He called to tell me that you died last night. Beatrice dropped her fork. It clattered onto the metal table. Excuse me, she whispered. He says you died of a heart attack at Sunny Meadows. I continued cutting a piece of pancake. He says he has already cremated you. And this Friday he is holding a funeral for you so he can claim the life insurance and sell our house. He told me not to come because I am too senile to understand what is happening. Beatrice's face went pale, then red. Her eyes, the same steel-gray eyes that had stared down bankers and contractors, flashed with a fire I hadn't seen in years. "He is holding a funeral for me," she asked, her voice low and dangerous. "Yes," I said, "and he thinks I am stuck here in Montana, helpless and alone." Beatrice stood up. She untied her apron and threw it on the chair. "Start the engine, Garrett." I smiled. It was a cold smile, a smile that meant war. "Where are we going?" I asked, even though I knew the answer. She looked at me, and for a second she didn't look like a grandmother. She looked like a general. "We are going to Seattle," she said. "If my son wants a funeral, let's give him one he will never forget." I nodded and walked toward the driver's seat of the RV. The engine roared to life, a deep, powerful rumble that echoed across the quiet lake. I checked the mirrors. I checked the fuel gauge. Full tank. It is a 10-hour drive to Seattle. I have $5.2 million in assets, a wife who is very much alive, and a son who just signed his own death warrant. Preston thinks he is burying his mother on Friday, but he has no idea that he just dug his own grave. The drive back to Seattle was a blur of asphalt and fury. The Montana landscape, usually so majestic with its sprawling pines and jagged peaks, was now just a gray smear outside the window of the RV. Beatrice sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead. She hadn't said a word since we pulled out of the campsite, but I could feel the heat of her anger radiating across the center console. It was a quiet, simmering rage, the kind that burns hotter than any shouting match. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, knuckles white. The engine of the Winnebago hummed beneath us, a steady, reliable sound that usually brought me comfort. Today it sounded like a countdown. 10 hours to Seattle. 10 hours until I faced the son who had just declared us dead. We were about an hour outside of Missoula when I decided to check the bank accounts. I knew Preston was fast, but I hoped I was faster. I handed the wheel over to Beatrice, who drove the 40-foot rig better than most truckers I knew, and pulled out my tablet. The signal was spotty as we wound through the mountain passes, but finally the banking app loaded. I typed in my username and password, my fingers tapping against the glass with a rhythm of dread. The little loading circle spun, and then a red box popped up. Access denied. Account frozen. Reason owner deceased. Incapacitated. Please contact your branch administrator. I stared at the screen. The words were clinical, cold, and utterly devastating. Deceased. Incapacitated. In the eyes of the financial system, Garrett Stone, the man who built the Westview Shopping Center and the Harbor Point condos, was no longer a person. I was a file to be closed. I tried the joint checking account. Locked. I tried the savings account, the one where we kept the emergency fund for the business. Locked. I tried the investment portfolio, the nest egg that had taken 40 years of sweat and grit to build. Locked. Preston hadn't just moved fast. He had moved with the precision of a predator who had been stalking his prey for years. He must have submitted the death certificate and the power of attorney documents within minutes of hanging up the phone. He had frozen $450,000 in liquid cash. Just like that. A bitter taste filled my mouth, metallic and sharp. I remembered 5 years ago. I remembered the night Preston had called me sobbing at 2 a.m. He was in Las Vegas in a hotel room that cost more per night than my first car. He was in deep with some very bad people. $480,000 in gambling debts. He begged me to help him. He swore on his life, on his unborn children, that if I bailed him out, he would change. He would get a real job. He would stop chasing get-rich-quick schemes. I drove to the bank the next morning and wired the money. It was a huge hit to my retirement fund, but he was my son. You do not let your son drown, even if he jumped into the ocean himself. I remember the look in his eyes when he came home. He looked humble. He looked grateful. "Thank you, Dad," he had said, hugging me. "You saved my life." I will never forget this. He didn't forget. He just learned. He learned exactly how much money I had and exactly where it was. He wasn't studying to be a better man. He was studying to be a better thief. And now the hand that had pulled him out of the fire was being bitten off at the wrist. Beatrice glanced over at me. "Is it bad?" she asked, her voice calm. He locked it all, I said, tossing the tablet onto the dashboard. "Checking savings investments. Everything is frozen." He used the power of attorney. The one I signed before my knee surgery last year, just in case something went wrong under anesthesia. He kept it. I told him to shred it, but he kept it. Beatrice nodded slowly. She didn't look surprised. She just looked disappointed, which was somehow worse. "So we are broke," she stated. "On paper, yes," I said. "On paper, we are dead broke ghosts driving a very expensive RV. We needed fuel." The gauge was ticking toward the quarter mark, and a beast this size drank diesel like water. I saw a truck stop ahead, the neon sign of a pilot flying J glowing against the darkening sky. I told Beatrice to pull over. I jumped out and swiped my credit card at the pump. The little screen flashed, "Authorization declined." I tried another card, the business card. "Authorization declined." I tried the debit card, the one I used for coffee and bait. "Card invalid. Contact issuer." I stood there in the cold wind, the smell of diesel fumes filling my nose. People were walking by, tired truckers and families on road trips buying snacks and stretching their legs. They looked at me, just an old man in a flannel shirt staring at a gas pump. They had no idea that I was a millionaire who couldn't buy 5 gallons of fuel. Preston thought he had me. He thought he had cut off my air supply. He thought that without access to the digital world, I would be helpless, stranded on the side of the road in Montana, forced to call him and beg for mercy, forced to accept the nursing home, forced to accept the death of my dignity. He forgot one thing. He forgot who raised him. He forgot that before I was a developer, before I was a CEO, I was a contractor. I worked in cash. I paid my guys in cash. I bought materials in cash. And old habits die hard. I walked back to the RV. Beatrice was watching me through the window. I opened the side door and knelt down near the entryway. There was a loose panel in the floorboard right under the passenger seat. It looked like a vent, but it wasn't. I pulled out my pocket knife, popped the hidden latch, and lifted the panel. Inside sat a metal lockbox. It was heavy, cold, and battered. I dragged it out and keyed in the combination. The lid creaked open. Inside were stacks of $100 bills, $50,000, my rainy day fund, my run money. I had started keeping it there years ago when the economy crashed in 2008, and banks were failing left and right. I never trusted a computer with my life. And looking at that beautiful, tangible green paper, I knew I was right. I pulled out a thick stack of bills, $5,000. I walked back to the pump, walked inside the station phone, and slapped $500 on the counter. "Pump 5, I told the cashier. "Diesel, fill it until it spills." The cashier, a young kid with piercings, looked at the cash, then at me. "You serious, old-timer?" "Dead serious," I said. I walked back out to the pump. As the fuel rushed into the tank, I looked at my reflection in the side mirror. I looked tired. I looked old. But I didn't look defeated. Preston had taken my cards. He had taken my accounts. But he hadn't taken my resources. And he certainly hadn't taken my fight. We had cash. We had a full tank of fuel. And we had 10 hours of anger to keep us awake. The lockdown had failed. The war had just begun, and it was going to be fought the old-fashioned way, with cash, grit, and a whole lot of horsepower. I climbed back into the driver's seat. Beatrice looked at the cash in my hand and smiled. It was a thin, sharp smile. "You always were a paranoid old badger," she said. "Paranoia pays," I replied, putting the rig into gear. Next stop, Seattle. And God help anyone who stands in our way. We hit the city limits of Seattle just as the clock struck midnight. The rain was falling hard, that familiar, relentless drizzle that chills you to the bone. It was the kind of weather that usually made me happy to be home sitting by the fireplace with a glass of scotch. But tonight, I wasn't going home. I was invading it. We didn't dare drive the RV up the hill to the neighborhood. A 40-foot Winnebago, parked in a driveway in Queen Anne, would draw too much attention, and if Preston saw us, the element of surprise would be lost. We needed to be invisible. We pulled into the Emerald City Motor Inn, a dilapidated motel on Aurora Avenue, where the neon sign flickered and the clerk behind the bulletproof glass didn't ask for ID, as long as you paid in cash. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and pine cleaner, a far cry from the master suite I had designed myself, but it would have to do. "You stay here, Beatrice," I said, handing her the room key. "Lock the deadbolt, and don't open it for anyone but me." "Where are you going, Garrett?" she asked, sitting on the edge of the sagging mattress. "I need to see it," I said. "I need to see what they are doing to our life." I took a rideshare to a spot 3 blocks away from my house. I pulled my cap down low and turned up the collar of my jacket against the rain. Walking up that hill, my legs felt heavy. I had walked this pavement 1,000 times with my dog waving to neighbors, feeling the pride of ownership. Now I was creeping through the shadows like a burglar casing a joint. When I reached the driveway, my heart hammered against my ribs. The house was lit up like a Christmas tree. Every light was on. In the driveway where my truck used to sit was a massive white box truck with the logo "Junk Be Gone" painted on the side. Junk. That is what they called it. I walked up the side path, stepping over the azaleas I had planted 10 years ago. I reached the side door, the one we always used. I pulled out my keychain, the brass key worn smooth by decades of use. I slid it into the lock and tried to turn it. It wouldn't budge. I tried again, wiggling it, forcing it. Nothing. The lock was new. The shiny brass was replaced by a matte black keypad lock. Preston hadn't just changed the locks. He had upgraded them to keep me out. I was a stranger at my own threshold. The house I framed. The house I wired, the house where I carried Beatrice over the threshold, was now a fortress built against me. I crept around to the back toward the large bay windows that looked out over the garden. The curtains were drawn, but there was a gap. I stepped into the mud, ruining my boots, and peered inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The living room was a war zone. My leather recliner, the one molded perfectly to my back, was gone. The oak bookshelves I had built by hand were empty, and in the center of the room stood Tiffany. She was wearing a white tracksuit and holding a clipboard, pointing her finger like a dictator. 2 men in blue coveralls were hauling boxes out of the hallway. They weren't moving carefully. They were dragging them. I watched as one of the men picked up a large framed photograph. I knew that photo. It was our wedding portrait from 1974. Beatrice in lace, me in a rented tuxedo with a ruffled shirt. It hung over the mantelpiece for 40 years. The man looked at Tiffany. "Trash it." I saw her mouth the words clearly. "Nobody wants old pictures. It is clutter." The man tossed the frame into a large plastic bin. I heard the glass shatter. The sound was faint through the double-paned window, but it echoed like a gunshot in my head. That wasn't just glass breaking. That was my history being swept away. Tiffany turned and walked to the window right in front of where I was hiding. I pressed myself flat against the siding. She was holding a swatch of fabric against the wall. It was gray. A lifeless, cold, industrial gray. "Agreeable gray," she said to someone in the room. "We need to paint over that awful yellow. And get rid of those heavy drapes. We need modern blinds. We need to stage this for the open house on Sunday." She was erasing us. She wasn't just cleaning. She was sanitizing the house of any trace that Garrett and Beatrice Stone had ever lived there. She was turning our home into a sterile product, a blank canvas for some tech millionaire to buy. She called our warm sun-yellow walls awful. She called our memories clutter. I wanted to smash the window. I wanted to storm in there and scream, but I couldn't. Not yet. I had to wait for the kill shot. Then the front door opened. I moved to the corner of the house to get a view of the driveway. Preston walked out. He looked terrible. His hair was messy, and he was pacing back and forth checking his phone. He wasn't helping with the move. He was waiting for someone. A few minutes later, a black sedan with tinted windows pulled up to the curb. It wasn't a dealer or a real estate agent. It was a beat-up Honda with aftermarket rims. A guy in a leather jacket stepped out. Preston rushed over to him. They didn't shake hands. The guy leaned against the car and crossed his arms. "Do you have it?" the guy asked. His voice carried in the wet night air. "Yeah, I have it," Preston said. His voice was shaking. "This is the real deal. 1980, solid gold. No box, but I have the appraisal papers." Preston reached into his pocket and pulled out a watch. My breath caught in my throat. It was my Rolex day date. The gold president bracelet glinted under the street lamp. That watch was a gift to myself the day I sold the company. It was engraved on the back, "To Garrett for building the dream." I kept it in the safe in the master bedroom. I only wore it on anniversaries. Preston handed the watch to the stranger. The man inspected it, turning it over, weighing the gold in his hand. He didn't care about the engraving. He didn't care about the 40 years of concrete and steel it represented. He just saw melted gold value. "$5 grand, the man said. "It is worth 20, Preston pleaded. $5 grand cash right now. Or I walk. No box, no papers, stolen goods for all I know." "Fine," Preston spat. "Just give me the money." The man reached into the car and pulled out a thick yellow envelope. He tossed it to Preston. My son caught it and immediately tore it open, thumbing through the bills with desperate, greedy fingers. He didn't look at the watch again. He didn't look at the house. He just looked at the cash. I stood there in the rain, water dripping off the brim of my cap, watching my son sell my legacy for a fraction of its worth to a fence in the middle of the night. He had sold my house in his mind. He had trashed my memories, and now he was pawning my achievements to pay off his bookie. The stranger drove off. Preston shoved the envelope into his jacket and walked back toward the house, stepping over a pile of clothes that had fallen out of the dumpster. I recognized the blue fabric on the wet pavement. It was my favorite flannel shirt. He wiped his muddy shoe on it as he walked inside. I didn't feel sadness anymore. The sadness had died the moment I heard that glass frame shatter. Now there was only cold calculation. I pulled out my phone and took a photo of the junk-be-gone truck. I took a photo of the dumpster filled with our lives, and I wrote down the license plate of the black sedan that just drove away with my watch. Preston wanted to play dirty. He wanted to strip me down to nothing. But he forgot that a man who builds skyscrapers starts by digging a hole. And I was about to dig a hole so deep he would never climb out of it. I turned around and walked back down the hill into the darkness. Let them paint the walls gray. Let them throw out the photos. They were just staging the set for their own public execution. And I would be the one pulling the lever. The Red Star Diner on 4th Avenue was the kind of place where the coffee tasted like battery acid and the menu hadn't changed since the Reagan administration. It was perfect. No one from Preston's social circle would be caught dead here. I walked in at 6 in the morning, pulling my baseball cap low over my eyes. The smell of frying bacon and stale cigarette smoke hit me instantly, reminding me of my early days on the construction site before I traded my work boots for wingtips. Mr. Harrington was already there, sitting in a booth at the back. He looked uncomfortable. For 30 years, I had only seen him in Italian wool suits, sitting behind a mahogany desk in a high-rise downtown. Now he was wearing a generic raincoat and looking over his shoulder every time the door chime rang. Harrington wasn't just my lawyer. He was the only man in Seattle who knew where all the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking. We had fought union disputes and zoning wars together, but I had never seen him look this rattled. I slid into the booth opposite him. He didn't say hello, he just slid a manila folder across the chipped laminate table. His hands were shaking slightly. "Garrett, tell me Beatrice is safe," Harrington whispered, leaning in. "She is at the motel watching daytime television and eating vending machine snacks," I said, keeping my voice low. "She is enjoying being a ghost." Harrington let out a breath he had been holding. "Thank God. Now look at this." I opened the folder. On top was a document that made my stomach turn over. It was a certificate of death. State of Washington. Name Beatrice Ellen Stone. Date of death yesterday. Time 02:14. Cause of death acute myocardial infarction. It was signed, stamped, and filed. According to the state of Washington, the woman I had kissed goodbye 20 minutes ago was a corpse. How I asked. My voice was calm, but under the table my hands were clenched into fists. "How do you get a death certificate for a woman who isn't even in the building?" Harrington took a sip of his coffee and grimaced. "I made some calls, Garrett. Discreet ones. The signature at the bottom. Dr. Eris Thorne. Do you know him?" The name sounded familiar. He was the medical director at Sunny Meadows, the facility Preston had shoved us into. A slick man with a smile that never reached his eyes. "I know him," I said. "He tried to prescribe me sedatives the first day we arrived. Said I seemed agitated." Harrington nodded. "He is not just a bad doctor, Garrett. He is a desperate one. My private investigator dug into his financials last night. Dr. Thorne is in deep with the same bookies your son uses. He owes 6 figures to a syndicate in Portland." The pieces clicked together like a well-laid foundation. Preston didn't just stumble upon an opportunity. He manufactured one. He found a man as desperate and morally bankrupt as he was. Preston probably promised to wipe Thorne's debt in exchange for a signature. One signature to kill a woman. One signature to unlock millions. "This is murder on paper," Harrington said, his voice hard. "Garrett, we need to go to the police, right now. We have the evidence. We produce Beatrice, and this whole house of cards collapses. Preston goes to jail for fraud. Thorne loses his license and goes to prison. We can end this by lunchtime." I looked down at the death certificate. I traced my finger over Beatrice's name. Ending it by lunchtime sounded nice. It sounded sensible. But it wasn't enough. "If we go to the police now," I said, closing the folder, "Preston will spin it. He will say it was a mistake. He will say the nursing home made a clerical error. He will claim he was a grieving son acting on bad information. He might get a slap on the wrist, maybe probation, and he will still come after my money. He will still wait for me to die." "So what do you want to do?" Harrington asked. "I want to bury him," I said. "Not literally. I want to bury him under the weight of his own greed. I want him to sign the sale papers on the house. I want him to cash the checks. I want him to commit to the crime so deeply that no lawyer on earth can save him." Harrington looked at me with a mix of fear and admiration. "That is dangerous, Garrett. You are playing chicken with a freight train." "I am the freight train," I said. Harrington sighed and pulled another document from his briefcase. "There is something else. The cremation." "What about it?" I asked. "Preston claims she was cremated immediately due to infectious disease protocols. But I checked the logs at the crematorium he listed. There was no intake for a Beatrice Stone last night. The incinerator wasn't even running." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "So there is no body," No Harrington said. "Which begs the question, what is in the urn he is going to display at the funeral tomorrow?" I leaned back against the vinyl booth. My son was going to stand in front of a room full of people and weep over a jar of dirt. The disrespect was so profound, it was almost impressive. "I want to see it," I said. "I want to see him hold that urn. I want to see the tears falling down his face while he holds a lie in his hands." Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It wasn't a call. It was an email notification. Preston thinks I am an old dinosaur. He thinks I use my smartphone just to make calls and look at pictures of my dog. He doesn't know that I have alerts set up for every financial movement attached to my Social Security number. I pulled the phone out, the screen glowing in the dim light of the diner. Subject: claim received. Policy number 8944201. I tapped the email open. It was from the life insurance company. "Dear beneficiary, we have received your claim for the death of Beatrice Stone. The death certificate has been verified. The payout of $1.5 million is being processed and will be deposited into the account on file within 48 hours. I turned the phone around and slid it across the table to Harrington. He looked at the screen, and his face went pale. "He did it," he whispered. "He actually pulled the trigger. $1.5 million. That was the price of his mother's life. He didn't wait a week. He didn't wait a day. He filed the claim before the sun even came up." Harrington looked up at me. "This is grand larceny, Garrett. Wire fraud. Insurance fraud. If he touches that money, he is looking at 20 years in federal prison." I took the phone back and stared at the number. 1.5 million. I remembered buying Preston his first baseball glove. I remembered teaching him to tie his tie for prom. I remembered the pride I felt when he graduated. All those memories were burning up in the fire of this betrayal. "Let it process," I said, standing up. "Garrett." "Are you sure?" Harrington asked, standing up with me. "Let the money hit the account," I said, buttoning my jacket. "Let him feel rich for 48 hours. Let him buy the champagne. Let him think he has won. Because when I walk into that funeral tomorrow, I am not just coming back from the dead. I am coming to collect the debt." I threw a $20 bill on the table for the coffee. "Go back to your office, Harrington. Prepare the trust documents. Prepare the transfer of the house title. And get the police ready on standby for tomorrow afternoon. But tell them to wait for my signal." "What is the signal?" Harrington asked. "You will know it," I said. "When the dead woman walks in the front door, that is the signal." I walked out of the diner and into the gray Seattle rain. The city was waking up. People were going to work, building their lives, saving for their futures. Somewhere in a luxury condo, my son was probably sleeping soundly, dreaming of the millions he had just stolen. "Sleep tight, Preston. Because the nightmare is coming, and it is driving a 40-foot RV. I kissed Beatrice goodbye at the door of the motel room number 112. She was sitting in a chair drinking bad coffee and watching a game show. I told her to lock the door and put the chain on. She looked at me with those sharp eyes and fixed the collar of my shirt. It was an old flannel shirt stained with motor oil that I usually wore to clean the gutters. Today, it was my costume. I had paired it with mismatched socks and a pair of trousers that were 2 sizes too big, held up by a frayed belt. I looked in the mirror, and I didn't see Garrett Stone, the millionaire contractor. I saw a broken, confused old man who had lost his way. That was exactly what they wanted to see. The taxi dropped me off 2 blocks from the Whispering Pines funeral home. I wanted to walk the rest of the way. I needed to get into character. I took out an old wooden cane I had bought at a thrift store years ago after I twisted my ankle on a job site. I leaned heavily on it, letting my shoulders slump forward. I practiced a tremor in my right hand. It wasn't hard to fake. The rage vibrating in my veins made my hands shake naturally. I just had to channel that anger into weakness. The funeral home was a grand building with white pillars and manicured hedges. It looked like a bank where you deposit bodies instead of money. In the parking lot, I saw Preston's leasing BMW parked next to a fleet of luxury sedans. Mercedes, Lexuses, Range Rovers. This wasn't a gathering of friends. Beatrice and I didn't have friends who drove cars like that. Our friends drove Ford trucks and Honda Civics. This was a networking event. My son was using his mother's funeral to close business deals. I walked up the steps, dragging my left foot slightly. The doorman looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust. He hesitated before opening the door as if he thought I was a homeless man looking for a warm place to sleep. I stumbled into the lobby. The air smelled of lilies and expensive cologne. Standing near the entrance to the main chapel were Preston and Tiffany. They looked like royalty. Preston was wearing a black Italian suit that fit him perfectly. Tiffany was in a black silk dress that probably cost more than my first work van. She was holding a glass of wine even though it was 10 in the morning. Preston saw me first. His eyes went wide. For a second I saw panic. He hadn't expected me to show up. He thought I was stranded in Montana, helpless and broke. He whispered something to Tiffany, and she spun around. Her face hardened into a mask of annoyance. They rushed over to me, not to hug me, but to intercept me, like security guards stopping a streaker at a football game. Dad Preston hissed, grabbing my arm hard enough to bruise. "What are you doing here? I told you to stay put." I looked at him with watery eyes, letting my mouth hang open slightly. "I missed the bus." I mumbled, my voice trembling. "I wanted to say goodbye to Mom." "Where is Mom?" Preston looked around, nervously checking to see if anyone was watching. He forced a smile, but his grip on my arm tightened. "You are confused, Dad. We talked about this. You are not well." Tiffany stepped in. She smelled of vanilla and ambition. She put a hand on my shoulder, but her nails dug into the fabric of my old shirt. "Listen to me, Garrett," she whispered, and her voice was like ice. "You are going to ruin everything. We have important people here. Investors, developers, people who can buy the house today. Do not say a word. Do not tell your boring stories. Do not talk about your construction days." I looked at her. I looked at this woman who I had welcomed into my family, who I had treated like a daughter. I blinked slowly. "Who are you?" I asked. It was the perfect line. Tiffany let out a frustrated sigh and rolled her eyes. "Oh, for God's sake, he doesn't even know me. He is completely gone." Preston looked relieved. If I was senile, I wasn't a threat. I was just a prop that proved he was the responsible adult taking charge of the estate. "Just put him in the corner," Preston said. "Get him a chair." They led me into the chapel. It was half full. I scanned the room. I didn't recognize a single face. There was no Mrs. Higgins from the bakery, no Pastor John from our church, no guys from my old construction crew. These were strangers, men in suits checking their watches, women looking at their phones. They were vultures circling a carcass, waiting for the reading of the will or the sale of the assets. Tiffany shoved me into a folding chair in the back corner behind a large fern. "Stay here," she ordered, pointing a finger in my face. "Sit. Stay." Like I was a dog. I slumped into the chair, clutching my cane. I watched them work the room. Preston was shaking hands with a man I recognized as a notorious real estate shark in Seattle. I heard snippets of their conversation. "Yes, it is a tragic loss," Preston said, putting on a sad face. "But we have to move forward. The property is a prime location. 2 acres. Zoning allows for subdivision. We can tear down the old house and put up 6 luxury townhomes. Tear it down." He was planning to bulldoze the house I built with my own hands. The house where he took his first steps. The house where Beatrice planted every rose bush in the garden. He wasn't just selling it. He was erasing it. The shark nodded, looking interested. "And the title? Is it clear?" "Oh, absolutely." Preston lied. "My father is... well, you can see him over there. He is not capable of managing anything anymore. I have full power of attorney. We can sign the papers Monday." I gripped the handle of my cane. The wood creaked. I wanted to stand up and break the cane over his head, but I didn't. I sat there and drooled a little. I played the part. Guests started to drift toward me. They didn't want to talk to me, but they felt obligated. A man with a shiny watch leaned in. "I am sorry for your loss, Mr. Stone," he said, looking at my stained shirt with distaste. I looked up at him blankly. "Have you seen my dog?" I asked. "I can't find my dog." The man stepped back, uncomfortable. He looked at Preston. "I am so sorry," Preston said, rushing over. "The shock has been too much for him. His mind has just shut down. He thinks it is 1990. The man nodded sympathetically. "Poor thing. At least he has a good son to take care of the estate." I almost laughed. A good son. The irony was so thick you could choke on it. The service began. It wasn't a religious service. It was a performance. Preston stood at the podium and spoke about Beatrice. But he didn't talk about her kindness or her humor. He talked about her dignity and how she would want us to be practical in these hard times. He used the word practical 5 times. I tuned him out. My eyes locked onto the front of the room. There was a table draped in white velvet. A large photo of Beatrice was on an easel. It was an old photo, one she hated because she thought her hair looked frizzy. They hadn't even bothered to find a good picture. And next to the photo was the urn. I squinted. Something was wrong. I knew every item in our house. I knew every vase, every bowl, every decoration. Preston had told me he bought a deluxe brass urn for $3,000. He had charged the estate for it. I stood up. My legs felt heavy for real this time. "Sit down, Dad," Tiffany hissed from the front row. I ignored her. I shuffled forward, leaning on my cane, tapping it loudly on the floor. Tap, tap, tap. The room went silent. Everyone watched the crazy old man making his way to the altar. Preston stopped speaking mid-sentence. "Dad, please sit down," he said, his voice tight. I kept walking. I needed to see it close up. I reached the table. I looked at the urn. It was gold. It was shiny. But as I leaned in closer, I saw a small chip in the paint near the rim. Underneath the gold paint, it wasn't brass. It was glass. I recognized the shape. The curved lid with the little knob on top. The way the base flared out. My heart stopped beating for a second. This wasn't an urn. It was the candy jar. The Anchor Hawking glass candy jar that sat on our kitchen counter for 20 years. The one Beatrice used to keep peppermint swirls in for the grandkids. I had bought it at Walmart for $5.99. Preston hadn't bought an urn. He had taken the candy jar from the kitchen spray, painted it gold, and put it on the altar. He had pocketed the $3,000 he claimed to have spent. He didn't even respect his mother enough to buy her a pot to rest in. He had put her alleged remains in a jar that used to hold sticky candy. I reached out with a shaking hand and touched the lid. The gold paint was still tacky. He must have painted it this morning in the garage. "Dad, don't touch that," Preston shouted, rushing toward me. I looked at him. I looked at the jar. I looked at the crowd. I turned to Preston. Tears were streaming down my face. Not fake tears. Real tears of rage and heartbreak. "Where are the mints?" I asked, my voice cracking. "This is the mint jar. Where are the mints, Preston?" The room gasped. Preston turned red. "He is confusing it with something else," Preston stammered, addressing the crowd. "It is the dementia." I stroked the lid of the jar. I felt the ridges of the glass under the cheap spray paint. I knew exactly what this was, just like I knew exactly what my son was. A cheap fake covered in a thin layer of gold. I looked at Preston, and for a split second I dropped the act. I looked him dead in the eye with the cold, hard stare of the man who used to fire incompetent subcontractors on the spot. He saw it. He saw the sharpness return to my eyes. He flinched. But then I blinked and let the confusion wash back over my face. "I want a mint," I wailed like a toddler. "I want a mint." Tiffany grabbed my arm and pulled me away. "Get him out of here," she whispered to Preston. "Put him in the car. He is ruining the vibe." They dragged me out of the chapel. But I had seen enough. I had seen the depth of their depravity. They hadn't just killed Beatrice on paper. They had turned her memory into a cheap arts and crafts project. As they shoved me into the back of a luxury sedan, I sat back and stopped shaking. I touched my pocket where my phone was hidden. "You want a show, Preston," I thought. "You just wait. The encore is going to be a killer." The organ music faded into a soft hum that vibrated against the floorboards of the chapel. The room went silent. It was a heavy, expectant silence, the kind you feel right before a judge reads a verdict. Preston stood up from the front row. He buttoned his jacket with a slow, deliberate movement, checking his reflection in the polished brass of the pulpit as he ascended the steps. He looked every inch the grieving son, his face a mask of solemn sorrow, his shoulders slumped just enough to suggest the weight of the world was resting on them. He adjusted the microphone. He took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and looked out over the sea of faces. He didn't look at me. He looked past me toward the investors and the business partners he was trying to impress. "Friends, family, distinguished guests," he began, his voice dropping an octave to sound deep and resonant. "We are gathered here today not just to mourn a death, but to celebrate a legacy. My mother, Beatrice Stone, was a woman of vision. I sat in the back, gripping the handle of my wooden cane until my knuckles turned the color of old bone. Vision. That was a business word. Beatrice didn't talk about vision. She talked about dinner. She talked about whether the grandkids were eating enough vegetables. She talked about the roses in the garden fighting off the aphids. She understood the value of hard work. Preston continued pulling a handkerchief from his pocket and dabbing at a dry eye. She understood that a family is like a corporation. It needs strong leadership. It needs asset management. It needs to grow. I felt bile rise in my throat. He was turning her into a spreadsheet. He was eulogizing a portfolio, not a person. I closed my eyes, and for a second, the smell of expensive lilies and stale perfume disappeared. I was back in our kitchen in 1982. The economy was in the toilet. Interest rates were sky high. I hadn't landed a contract in 3 months. I came home that night with my work boots covered in mud and my spirit broken. I had told Beatrice we might lose the truck. She didn't talk about asset management. She didn't talk about corporate leadership. She sat me down, put a bowl of stew in front of me, and then she pulled out her sewing kit. I watched her under the dim light of the kitchen table. She took my work shirts, the ones with the elbows blown out, and the collars frayed, and she started stitching. She turned the collars inside out so they looked new. She patched the elbows with denim scraps. She worked until 3 in the morning. Her fingers pricked and bleeding, just so I would look respectable when I went to bid on jobs the next day. She saved us with a needle and thread. She saved us with silence and soup. I opened my eyes. Preston was still talking. "Mom always wanted us to be secure," he said, his voice cracking with practiced emotion. "She used to tell me, Preston, promise me you will protect what your father built. Promise me you will take the helm when he can no longer steer the ship, liar." I almost shouted it. The word sat on my tongue like a hot coal. Beatrice never said that. Beatrice used to look at Preston and say, "I hope one day you learn the difference between price and value." The audience was eating it up. I saw heads nodding. I saw tissues dabbing at eyes. They saw a devoted son stepping up to the plate. They didn't see the wolf wearing a suit. Preston paused for effect. He looked down at the podium, composing himself. It was a masterclass in manipulation. And that brings me to the difficult part, he said, looking up with a brave, tragic smile. As many of you know, my father Garrett is with us today. He gestured toward the back corner where I sat. Heads turned, eyes landed on me. The crazy old man with the mismatched socks and the stained shirt. The man clutching a cane like a weapon. Dad, Preston said, his voice dripping with condescending sweetness. I know you are confused right now. I know you might not understand everything I am saying. But I want you to know that I am fulfilling Mom's last wish. He took a breath. This was it. The pivot. In honor of Beatrice Stone and to ensure that her legacy lives on forever, my wife Tiffany and I are establishing the Stone Family Foundation. There was a murmur of approval in the room. A foundation. It sounded so noble. It sounded so charitable. But I knew what it was. I had seen the paperwork on his desk months ago when I dropped by unannounced. It was a shell company, a tax haven, a place to dump assets, wash money through fake charitable grants, and pull it out the other side as salary for the directors. And the directors were Preston and Tiffany. And Preston continued raising his voice over the murmur. I am proud to announce that my father, in his lucid moments, has agreed to the most generous gift of his life. To kickstart this foundation, and to ensure the future of our family, we will be liquidating the family estate. The house, the land, the holdings, all of it will be donated to the foundation to do good work in the community. The room erupted in polite applause. People turned to me and smiled, nodding their heads, thinking I was a philanthropist. Thinking I was a saint. I wasn't a saint. I was a volcano waiting to erupt. He was stealing it all, right in front of witnesses. He was locking me into a lie. If I objected now, I was the crazy old man making a scene. If I stayed silent, I was consenting to my own bankruptcy. He was using the social pressure of a funeral to seal the deal. It was brilliant. It was evil. I looked at the fake golden urn on the table. I looked at the smiling photo of Beatrice. Preston beamed. He looked at Tiffany in the front row. She gave him a subtle thumbs up. They thought they had won. They thought they had just secured a multi-million-dollar payday with a 5-minute speech. I gripped the cane so hard, the wood groaned. I planted my feet on the floor. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stand up, to march down that aisle and smash that microphone into his teeth, to tell them all that the urn was a candy jar and the foundation was a scam. But I remembered Harrington's advice. Wait for the signature. Wait for the crime to be completed. I took a deep breath. I forced my hand to relax. I forced my shoulders to slump. I looked at the floor and let out a low, confused moan, rocking back and forth in my chair. Poor man, a woman in front of me whispered to her husband. He doesn't even know he just gave away his fortune. Oh, I knew. I knew exactly what was happening. Preston was digging a hole. He was standing at the bottom of it, shoveling dirt over his own head, thinking he was building a mountain. He finished his speech. Thank you all. Please join us at the family home for a reception. We have some important documents to sign to make this official. He stepped down from the podium, basking in the applause. He walked past me on his way out. He didn't stop. He didn't look me in the eye. He just breezed past, smelling of victory. I watched him go. I watched the crowd follow him like sheep. Enjoy the applause, son, I thought. Enjoy the spotlight. Because the next time you stand in front of a crowd, it won't be in a chapel. It will be in a courtroom. And I will be the one reading the verdict. I slowly stood up, leaning heavily on my cane, and shuffled toward the exit. The show was moving to the house, and the grand finale was about to begin. The ride back to the house was silent. I sat in the back of Preston's BMW, staring out the window at the rain-streaked streets of the neighborhood I had helped build. Every corner held a memory. That was the corner where I taught Preston to ride a bike. That was the park where Beatrice and I walked every Sunday morning holding hands. Now those streets looked different. They looked like assets on a map. They looked like dollar signs to the man driving the car. When we pulled into the driveway of my home, I felt a physical blow to my chest. The junk-be-gone truck was gone. In its place was a fleet of luxury cars lining the curb. A subtle sign had been placed in the yard. It didn't say for sale yet, but it said coming soon with the logo of a high-end real estate firm. The firm Preston worked for. He was listing his own parents' house before the body was even cold. We walked inside. The air didn't smell like Beatrice's pot roast or the cedar wood of my old humidor. It smelled of vanilla and fresh latex paint. Artificial. Sterile. They had staged the house. My comfortable leather recliner was gone, replaced by a stiff modern chair that looked like a torture device. The family photos were gone. The walls were painted that soulless gray Tiffany loved so much. It felt like walking into a hotel lobby, not the home where I had raised a family. Preston led me to a chair in the corner of the living room. "Stay here, Dad," he muttered. "Try not to spill anything." I sat down, gripping my cane. I watched as the funeral reception transformed instantly into an open house. There were no tears. There were no stories about Beatrice. Instead, there were people wandering through the rooms, tapping on the walls, checking the crown molding, and looking out the windows at the view of the sound. I saw a woman in a blazer I recognized as a colleague of Preston's. She was leading a couple through the dining room. "Notice the open floor plan," she said, her voice carrying over the low hum of conversation. "This wall can be easily removed to create a chef's kitchen. The bones of the house are good, but it needs a full update." A full update. That meant gutting it. That meant ripping out the oak floors I had laid myself in 1985. That meant tearing down the cabinets Beatrice had picked out. I tightened my grip on the cane. I wanted to tell them that the bones of this house were stronger than their marriages, but I kept my mouth shut. I stared at the floor and rocked back and forth, playing the part of the ghost in the machine. Tiffany walked into the room. She was holding a glass of white wine and talking on her cell phone. She didn't see me, or maybe she just didn't care. To her, I was just another piece of old furniture she hadn't managed to throw out yet. She leaned against the mantel, the very mantel where our wedding photo used to hang. "Yes, Mom, it is going perfectly," she said into the phone. Her voice was loud, confident, and cruel. "We have about 50 people here, at least 5 serious buyers. Preston is working his magic." She took a sip of wine and laughed. "No, Mom, don't worry about the old man. We have it handled. There is a state facility in Tacoma. Not the nice one, the one funded by Medicaid. We are moving him there Monday morning. It is better this way. He won't know the difference. He thinks I am the maid half the time anyway." I sat there and listened to my daughter-in-law plan my exile. Tacoma. That was an hour away. A state facility meant a shared room, bad food, and nurses who were too overworked to care if you lived or died. She was discarding me like a used wrapper. And the money, she continued, lowering her voice slightly, but not enough. "Mom, you should see the listings in Miami. We found a penthouse in South Beach. Floor-to-ceiling glass. Private elevator. Preston says with the cash from the house sale and the insurance payout, we can buy it outright. No mortgage. We are finally going to live the life we deserve. The life they deserved. They thought they deserved paradise because they had successfully killed off the previous generation." I looked at Tiffany's back. I looked at the expensive fabric of her dress. I thought about the thousands of dollars I had given them for down payments, for cars, for vacations. It was never enough. It was never going to be enough until they had picked the bones clean. Just then I saw him, the man Harrington had hired. Let's call him Mr. Sterling. He looked the part perfectly. Navy suit, graying hair at the temples, an air of quiet, impatient wealth. He wasn't drinking wine. He was standing by the window looking at the property with a critical eye. Preston spotted him. My son had a radar for money. He excused himself from a conversation with a neighbor and made a beeline for Sterling. I could see the hunger in Preston's eyes. He needed a buyer today. He needed the cash before anyone started asking questions about the death certificate or the will. I leaned forward slightly, straining to hear. "Mr. Stone, I presume?" Sterling said, his voice smooth and authoritative. "Yes, Preston Stone," Preston said, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming." "Did you know my mother?" Sterling ignored the question. He ignored the hand. "I am not here for the eulogy, Mr. Stone. I represent a private investment group. We acquire prime real estate for development. I understand this property is coming to market." Preston dropped the grieving son act instantly. "Yes, well, as you can see, it is a unique opportunity. 2 acres, unobstructed views. The zoning allows for multifamily units. We are preparing to list it at $3.2 million. Sterling laughed. A short, sharp bark of a laugh. 3.2 is a fantasy in this market with these interest rates. And looking at the structure, it is a teardown. I am not paying for the house, I am paying for the dirt." Preston's smile faltered. "Well, we feel that the market value is—" "I don't have time for a bidding war," Sterling interrupted. "I have a flight to Tokyo tonight. Here is the offer. 2.8 million. All cash. No inspection. No contingencies. We close in 72 hours. I saw Preston's throat move as he swallowed. $2.8 million. Cash. It was less than the house was worth, but it was fast. And fast was exactly what a criminal needed. If he waited for a traditional sale, it would take months. Inspections, title searches, banks asking questions. But a cash deal with an aggressive investor, that could be done in days. 2.8, Preston repeated. "Take it or leave it," Sterling said, checking his Rolex. "And I need an answer now." I saw the wheels turning in Preston's head. He did the math. 2.8 million plus the 1.5 million from the insurance. That was $4.3 million. Enough for the penthouse. Enough for the debts. Enough to disappear before anyone realized Beatrice wasn't in that gold-painted candy jar. "We can do that," Preston said, his voice trembling with excitement. "But the title, it is in my father's name." Sterling glanced over at me, the old man in the corner staring at his shoes. "And is there a problem with the title?" "No," Preston said quickly. "No problem at all. I have full power of attorney. He is incapacitated. I can sign for him. We can sign the preliminary agreement right now if you have it." "I have it in the car," Sterling said. I watched them walk toward the study. My study. The room where I had drawn the blueprints for this very house. The room where I had signed the contracts that built my company. Now it was going to be the room where my son signed his own arrest warrant. I waited a beat, then I slowly stood up. My knees popped. I leaned on my cane and began to shuffle toward the study. "Where are you going, Dad?" Tiffany asked, stepping in front of me. She looked annoyed that I was moving. "Bathroom," I mumbled, pointing vaguely down the hall. "Just go in the powder room," she said, pointing to the small guest bath. "And don't make a mess." I nodded and shuffled past her. But I didn't go to the powder room. I waited until she turned back to her friends, then I slipped into the hallway that led to the study. The door was slightly ajar. I could see Preston sitting at my mahogany desk. Sterling was pulling a thick document out of his briefcase. "Sign here, here, and here," Sterling said. "And this clause states that you guarantee the property is free of liens and that you have the sole legal authority to sell." "I do," Preston said, picking up the pen. His hand wasn't shaking. He was steady. He was ready to sell his father's soul for a wire transfer. I stood in the shadows of the hallway. I reached into my pocket and felt the cool metal of the remote control Harrington had given me. It controlled the new electronic lock on the front door. The door I had rigged just hours ago while the house was empty. Preston put the pen to the paper. The ink flowed. He signed his name. Then he signed my name, followed by the letters POA. It was done. He had officially committed fraud. He had sold a house he didn't own with authority he didn't have. I pressed the button on the remote in my pocket. From the front of the house, a loud electronic chime echoed through the hallway, followed by the sound of the heavy front door unlatching and swinging open. Preston looked up. "What was that?" he asked. I smiled in the darkness. That wasn't just the door opening. That was the curtain rising on the final act. "Showtime, son," I whispered. The heavy oak door of the study clicked shut behind them, enclosing the three of them in a space that had been my sanctuary for 30 years. I stood in the shadows of the hallway, listening through the crack I had left in the doorframe. This room was where I had pored over blueprints until my eyes blurred. It was where I had calculated the costs of steel and lumber to the penny. It was a room built on precision and honesty. Now it smelled of greed and cheap perfume. Preston sat behind my desk. He looked small in my chair. He spun around, attempting to look like a CEO, but he just looked like a child playing dress-up in his father's clothes. Tiffany stood by the window looking out at the rain, tapping her foot impatiently. She didn't care about the room or its history. She was mentally spending the money they were about to steal. Mr. Sterling, the investor, sat opposite Preston. He placed his briefcase on the desk and opened it with a satisfying click. He pulled out a thick stack of documents. These weren't just standard real estate forms. Harrington had prepared them specifically to be a legal iron cage. "Here is the purchase agreement," Sterling said, sliding the papers across the mahogany surface. "As we discussed, the price is $2.8 million cash. The funds are currently in escrow and will be released to your designated account immediately upon the execution of this contract. However, time is of the essence. My flight to Tokyo leaves in 3 hours. If we don't sign now, the deal is off." The pressure was on. I saw beads of sweat forming on Preston's forehead. He wiped them away with the back of his hand. He was terrified of losing the deal, but he was trying to act cool. "Of course," Preston said, his voice cracking slightly. "We are ready to proceed. We don't want to waste your time." Sterling leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Before you sign, Mr. Stone, I must ask one final question for due diligence. This deed is currently in the name of Garrett and Beatrice Stone. You have provided a death certificate for your mother, which grants your father full ownership, and you are claiming to act on behalf of your father." "Yes, that is correct," Preston said, shuffling the papers. "Here is the certificate. As you can see, it is official. State of Washington. My mother passed away yesterday." I watched through the crack in the door as he handed over the fake document. The paper that declared Beatrice dead while she was sitting in a motel room eating potato chips. He handed it over without a tremor in his hand. He had practiced this lie so many times in his head that it had become his truth. Sterling glanced at the death certificate, then looked Preston dead in the eye. "And your father? I saw him in the living room. He seems physically present. Does he have any opinion on this sale? Does he understand that you are liquidating his primary residence?" Preston laughed. It was a cold, dismissive sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He leaned back in my chair and waved his hand as if swatting away a fly. "Mr. Sterling, my father doesn't have opinions anymore. He has delusions. The man you saw out there doesn't know what day of the week it is. He thinks he is still running a construction crew in 1985. Tiffany chimed in from the window, her voice sharp. "He is completely incompetent. We are doing this for his own good. The money will go toward his care." Sterling nodded slowly. "And the legal authority? You are sure he authorized this?" Preston reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out another document. It was the power of attorney, the one I had signed before my surgery, the one that was supposed to be used only if I was in a coma. "Here it is," Preston said, slamming it on the desk. "Full durable power of attorney. It gives me the right to sell, manage, and liquidate any and all assets. And just to be safe, I had him sign a few blank transfer forms last year when he was having a good day. He smiled a smug, arrogant smile. He signed a stack of blank papers for me. He thought they were insurance forms. He doesn't know a thing. He trusts me implicitly. That is the sad part about dementia. They trust the people who are taking care of them. I felt a cold rage settle in my chest. He wasn't just admitting to fraud. He was bragging about it. He was boasting about how easy it was to trick the man who had raised him. He called my trust sad. It wasn't sad. It was sacred. And he had just urinated on it. Sterling picked up the pen. A heavy, expensive fountain pen. He held it out to Preston. "Very well," Sterling said. "If you are ready to certify these facts under penalty of perjury, then we can conclude this business. Please sign here, here, and here, and initial the bottom of page 4. That clause specifically states that you swear under oath that Beatrice Stone is deceased and that Garrett Stone is mentally incapacitated." Preston took the pen. He didn't hesitate. He didn't pause to think about the moral weight of what he was doing. He only saw the $2.8 million. He saw the penthouse in Miami. He saw the end of his gambling debts. He put the nib of the pen to the paper. The scratching sound was loud in the quiet room. Scritch. Scratch. He signed his name. Preston Stone. Then he signed my name. Garrett Stone by POA. He flipped the page. He signed the affidavit of death. He signed the warranty deed. He signed the wire transfer instructions directing the money into a new account that I knew he controlled exclusively. With every stroke of that pen, he was hammering a nail into his own coffin. He wasn't just selling a house. He was committing wire fraud. He was committing bank fraud. He was committing perjury. And because the amount was over $1 million and involved interstate commerce, he was committing a federal felony. Tiffany walked over and looked over his shoulder, her eyes greedy and bright. "Is it done?" she whispered. Preston capped the pen and handed it back to Sterling. "It is done. The house is yours. When do the funds clear?" Sterling looked at the documents. He checked the signatures. He checked the dates. He closed the folder calmly and locked it. "The funds will be released immediately," Sterling said, standing up. "But there is one small problem, Mr. Stone." Preston stood up, smiling, extending his hand. "What is that?" Sterling didn't shake his hand. He looked past Preston toward the hallway door where I was standing. "The problem," Sterling said, his voice dropping its friendly tone, "is that the owner of this house doesn't seem to agree with your assessment of his mental state. And I believe the deceased woman is currently listed as a co-signer on the account that just received the wire transfer." Preston frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" "I told you she is dead." I pushed the door open. It swung wide, hitting the wall with a thunderous crash. I didn't shuffle this time. I didn't lean on my cane. I walked into the room with my head high, my shoulders back, and my eyes burning with a fire that had been banked for too long. I walked straight to the desk. I looked at my son. I looked at the man who had just sold me out for a condo in Florida. Preston froze. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a sheet of paper. His mouth opened and closed like a fish on a hook. "Dad," he stammered. "I thought you were in the bathroom." I looked at the folder in Sterling's hand. Then I looked at Preston. I said, my voice steady and deep. "But I finished my business. Just like you finished yours." I reached out and picked up the power of attorney document from the desk. I held it up to the light. "You said I signed blank papers, Preston. You said I don't know a thing." I ripped the paper in half. Then I ripped it again. I let the pieces flutter down onto the desk like confetti. "I know exactly what day it is, son. I know exactly who I am. And most importantly, I know that the penalty for federal wire fraud carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years. Preston looked at the torn paper. Then he looked at Sterling. Then he looked at Tiffany, who was backing away toward the window. Sterling pulled a badge from his jacket pocket. It wasn't a business card. It was a gold badge. "I am not an investor," Mr. Stone Sterling said. "My name is Detective Reynolds. I work with the Fraud Division. And I believe you just confessed to multiple felonies on a recorded line." He pointed to the briefcase, which had a small red light blinking on the side. Preston's knees gave out. He collapsed into my chair. But it didn't look like a throne anymore. It looked like the electric chair, and the switch had just been pulled. The room was silent except for the sound of Preston's ragged breathing. He was slumped in the leather chair, staring at the torn pieces of the power of attorney document scattered on the desk like confetti at a disastrous parade. Detective Reynolds stood over him, badge glinting in the low light, a silent sentinel of the law. Tiffany was pressed against the bookshelf, her face a mask of pure terror, clutching her glass of Chardonnay as if it were a lifeline. They thought the nightmare was over. They thought the worst thing that could happen was an arrest. They were wrong. The arrest was just the intermission. The main act was about to walk through the door. I reached into my pocket again. My fingers found the cool plastic of the remote control. I didn't look at Preston. I looked at the hallway leading to the front door. Ding dong! The doorbell chimed. It was a cheerful, welcoming sound that echoed bizarrely in the tension-filled room. Preston jumped as if he had been shot. His eyes darted around the room, wild and panicked. "Who is that?" he whispered. "Is it the police? Are there more of them?" I didn't answer. I just pressed the button on the remote. Click. Whir. The sound of the heavy front door unlatching and swinging open via the new automatic mechanism I had installed drifted down the hallway. Then came the sound of heels clicking on the hardwood floor. Click, click, click. It wasn't the heavy tread of a police officer. It was a rhythm I knew better than my own heartbeat. It was a purposeful, confident stride. The sound grew louder, closer, echoing off the gray walls that Tiffany had so lovingly painted to erase us. A figure appeared in the doorway of the study. Preston stopped breathing. Tiffany let out a small, strangled squeak. Standing there, framed by the dark wood of the doorframe, was Beatrice. But this wasn't the Beatrice they remembered. This wasn't the woman in the nursing home gown hunched over a walker. This wasn't the frail old lady they had laughed about in private. She was wearing a dress the color of spilled wine, a deep, vibrant crimson. It was the same shade she had worn on our first date at the Italian restaurant on Pike Street 50 years ago. She had pulled it out of storage, had it tailored in Montana, and now she wore it like a suit of armor. Her silver hair was styled perfectly, pulled back to reveal her face. Her lips were painted a bold red. She looked radiant. She looked powerful. She looked alive. The silence in the room shattered. Crash. The wineglass slipped from Tiffany's trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood floor, sending shards of crystal and splashes of white wine flying across the room. She didn't even blink. Her mouth was hanging open, her eyes bulging. Preston pushed himself back in the chair, his heels scrabbling against the floor mat. He looked like he was seeing a demon. His face drained of the little color it had left, turning a sickly shade of gray. Mom," he stammered. His voice was a breathless wheeze. "Mom." He looked at the detective, then back at the woman in the doorway. "You said she was dead. You showed me the certificate. Is this a ghost? Am I hallucinating?" Beatrice didn't say a word. She didn't even look at him. She stepped into the room, her heels crunching softly on the broken glass of Tiffany's wine. She walked past Tiffany as if she were a piece of furniture. She walked past the detective, who nodded respectfully at her. She walked straight toward the desk where Preston was cowering. She stopped in front of the desk. Her eyes swept over the signed contracts, the fake death certificate, and the torn power of attorney. Then her gaze landed on the object sitting on the corner of the desk. The golden urn. The spray-painted candy jar that Preston had brought in to seal the deal to prove to the investor that the owner was truly gone. Beatrice looked at the jar with a mixture of amusement and disgust. She reached out with a manicured hand and picked it up. She held it to the light, inspecting the cheap gold paint that was already flaking off on her fingers. Preston was shaking so hard the chair was vibrating. "Mom," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. I can explain. It was for your own good." Beatrice ignored him. She unscrewed the lid of the jar. The grinding sound of glass on glass was loud in the quiet room. She looked inside. She dipped a finger into the jar. Preston gasped. "Don't, Mom, that's you. I mean, that's the ashes." Beatrice pulled her finger out. It was coated in a gray, gritty dust. She brought her finger to her nose and sniffed. Then, to the absolute horror of everyone in the room, she touched her finger to her tongue. Tiffany gagged, covering her mouth with her hand. Beatrice paused, tasting the grit. She frowned. She smacked her lips, analyzing the flavor profile of her own alleged remains. Then she turned her head and spat the grit onto the expensive Persian rug. She looked directly at Preston. Her eyes were cold, hard flint. "Cat litter," she said. Her voice was calm, clear, and cutting. "You cremated me with cat litter, Preston." Preston couldn't speak. He just made a choking sound. Beatrice tilted the jar, pouring a little pile of the gray granules onto the signed contract. "Fresh step," she said, analyzing the pile. "Or maybe Tidy Cats. It definitely has that cheap clay taste. You couldn't even splurge for the premium clumping kind." "Could you, son? You just went to the garage, scooped up some litter from the bag we keep for the neighbor's cat, put it in my candy jar, and spray-painted it gold." She slammed the jar back down on the desk. The sound was like a gavel coming down. "You stood in front of God, and everyone at that church holding a jar of cat toilet sand and cried about my legacy." Beatrice leaned over the desk, bringing her face inches from his. "I am not a ghost, Preston. Ghosts can't testify. But I am very much alive, and I am going to be the star witness at your trial." Preston began to sob, ugly, heaving sobs of a man who realized there was no way out. "Mom, please. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It was the debt. They were going to hurt me." Beatrice stood up straight. She smoothed down the front of her red dress. "I used to kiss your scraped knees when you cried like that," she said softly. "But you are not a child anymore. You are a predator, and I am done being your prey." She turned to Detective Reynolds. "Detective," she said, her voice regaining its steel. "I believe this man has signed a contract selling my home. I would like to report a case of identity theft, forgery, and elder abuse. And I have the real death certificate right here." She reached into her purse and pulled out a piece of paper. She dropped it onto the pile of cat litter. It wasn't a death certificate. It was a birth certificate. "It is the birth of my new life," she said, "and the death of your inheritance. Take him away." "Chào người anh em Cường Gia Trang đây. Tôi đã hoàn thành phần 10 lạt mật thề confrontation. Đúng như yêu cầu một, kỹ thuật Việt liền mạch không ngắt quãng tối ưu, cho giọng đọc AI, ngắt nghĩ bằng dấu câu chuẩn, không dùng ký tự lạ. 2. Nội dung Garrett trút bỏ lớp vỏ bọc giả nữa, chiếm lại quyền kiểm soát và tung ra bằng chứng thép trên TV, dẫn đến sự sụp đổ hoàn toàn của Preston. 3. Độ dài and chi tiết. Đảm bảo độ sâu sắc về tâm lý và sự kịch tính của hành động. Dưới đây là nội dung tiếng Anh. Anselm Panchadastra. The sound of my wife's voice hung in the air, like smoke after a gunshot. She had said her piece, and now the room was filled with a suffocating silence. Preston was trembling in the chair, and Tiffany was pressed against the wall looking like a trapped animal. They were waiting for the police to move in. They were waiting for the handcuffs. But I wasn't done yet. The police could wait. I had my own sentence to pass first. I looked down at the wooden cane in my hand. It was a cheap thing I had bought at a thrift store, scuffed and worn just like the persona I had worn all morning. I felt the weight of it one last time. It represented every insult, every dismissal, every time my son had looked at me and seen a burden instead of a father. I tightened my grip on the handle, and then I threw it. It flew across the room, spinning end over end until it smashed into the gray wall with a violence that made Tiffany scream. The cane clattered to the floor, rolling to a stop near the fireplace. I stood up. I didn't stand up slowly. I didn't groan. I didn't hold my back. I stood up the way I had stood up for 40 years on job sites. I planted my feet shoulder-width apart and straightened my spine until I towered over the desk. I rolled my shoulders back and the fabric of my old flannel shirt stretched tight against my chest. I wasn't the frail old man anymore. I was Garrett Stone, the man who could still lift a 100-pound bag of cement without breaking a sweat. Preston looked up at me and his eyes went wide. He shrank back in the chair, trying to make himself small. He looked like he was seeing a ghost transforming into a giant. "Dad," he whispered, his voice shaking. "What are you doing?" I didn't answer him. I walked around the desk. My steps were heavy and deliberate. Thud, thud, thud. I stopped right next to him. I could smell the fear on him. It smelled like sweat and expensive cologne turning sour. I reached out and grabbed the folder of documents from the desk. The purchase agreement, the wire transfer forms, the lies he had signed in ink. I held them up in front of his face. "You said I was confused," I said. My voice was low and rough like gravel in a mixer. "You told these people I was senile. You told them I didn't know what day it was." I leaned in closer. "I know exactly what day it is, Preston. It is the day you thought you could bury me. But you forgot one thing. You forgot who taught you how to dig." I tossed the folder onto the desk. It landed with a heavy slap. "You think I don't remember things?" I continued, my voice rising with every word. "You think my mind is gone? Let me tell you what I remember. I remember the combination to the floor, safe in the garage. Left 18, right 24, left 36. I remember because it is the date I started my company. I remember the day you came to me 5 years ago, crying about your gambling debts. I remember writing that check for $480,000. I remember you promising me on your grandmother's Bible that you would never gamble again. And I remember exactly when the money started missing from the company accounts last year. Small amounts at first. 500 here, 1,000 there. You thought I wouldn't notice. You thought the old man just looks at the bottom line. But I look at every line, Preston. I built my life on details, and I watched you steal from me dollar by dollar." Preston was shaking his head, tears streaming down his face. "No, Dad. I didn't steal. I borrowed. I was going to pay it back. The market was just—" "Shut up," I roared. The sound of my voice filled the room, shaking the glass in the windows. "Don't you lie to me. Not anymore. You said I never signed the power of attorney. You stood right there and told this detective that I signed blank papers because I didn't know what I was doing." I pointed a finger at his chest. A hard, calloused finger. "I never signed anything, Preston. I have never signed a blank piece of paper in my life. You forged my signature. You practiced it. I found the notebook in your old bedroom 2 weeks ago. Pages and pages of you practicing my name, trying to get the loop of the G just right." Preston looked down at his hands. He couldn't meet my gaze. I walked over to the large flat-screen television mounted above the fireplace. It was part of the staging. Tiffany had insisted on it to show off the modern wiring. I pulled a small black flash drive from my pocket. "You want to talk about reality?" I asked. "Let's look at reality." I plugged the drive into the side of the TV. I picked up the remote and pressed play. The screen flickered to life. It was black and white footage, granular but clear. The timestamp in the corner read 2 days ago. The image showed the interior of a small office. I saw Preston sitting there, and sitting across from him was Dr. Thorne, the medical director from the nursing home. Preston gasped. How did you get that?" I ignored him. I turned up the volume. On the screen, Preston was pushing a thick white envelope across the desk toward the doctor. "Here is 10,000 cash," Preston said on the video. His voice was tinny but unmistakable. "Plus, I will wipe your debt with the syndicate. Just sign the death certificate." Dr. Thorne picked up the envelope. He looked nervous. He kept checking the door. "Are you sure she is dead?" Preston the doctor asked. "I need to see the body." "She is dead enough," Preston replied with a laugh. "She is out of the picture. My dad is clueless. Just sign the paper, Aris. Date it for yesterday. Put down heart attack. No one will question it. We cremate her fast, and by the time anyone looks, she is just dust." The video ended. The screen went black. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. I turned back to my son. "Dead enough," I repeated. "That is what you called your mother, dead enough." Tiffany slid down the wall and sat on the floor, covering her face with her hands. She knew it was over. The penthouse in Miami was gone. Her freedom was gone. Preston looked at the blank screen, then at me. He looked at the detective who was now unclicking a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The reality of the situation finally hit him. He wasn't just caught. He was destroyed. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He did something much more pathetic. He slid out of the chair and fell to his knees. He crawled across the Persian rug toward me, reaching out for my legs. "Dad. Please," he sobbed. "You don't understand." I took a step back. I wouldn't let him touch me. "You have to help me, Dad," he begged, looking up at me with red, swollen eyes. It wasn't just the gambling. It was worse. He pointed a shaking hand toward the window. "I owe money to the Ivanov brothers, the Russian loan sharks in Portland. I owe them $2 million, Dad. I lost it on crypto. I tried to make it back, but I lost it all." He grabbed the hem of my pants. I kicked his hand away. "They gave me a deadline, Dad. Friday. Today. They said if I didn't have the money by tonight, they would kill me. They said they would cut me into pieces and mail me to you." He was blubbering now, snot running down his nose. "That is why I did it, Dad. I did it to survive. I needed the insurance money. I needed the house money. I was trying to save my life." He looked at me with that same look he had when he was 6 years old and broke a window, expecting me to fix it, expecting me to pull out my wallet and make the bad things go away. "Build me for your life," I said coldly. "You were willing to sell my house, kill your mother on paper, and throw me into a state asylum just to pay off your bookie." "Yes," Preston cried. "Yes. I was scared. I am scared. Dad, please. If I go to jail, I will be safe from them, but if I don't have the money—" He stopped, realizing what he was saying. I looked down at him. I looked at the son I had raised, the son I had loved, and I saw a stranger who would burn down the world to keep himself warm. "You are right, Preston," I said. "You are in a lot of trouble." I looked at Detective Reynolds. "Officer, I believe this man has confessed to conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and forgery. And now he has confessed to involvement with organized crime." Preston screamed. "No, Dad. You have $5 million. You can pay them. You can save me. Just write a check. One last time, please." I looked at Beatrice. She was standing by the door watching her son beg. Her face was like stone. She didn't look away, but she didn't move to comfort him either. She knew as well as I did that the time for comfort was over. I looked back at Preston. "I have $5 million, I said, my voice calm and final. "That is true." I leaned down so my face was level with his. "But I don't have a son. My son died the moment he decided I was better off dead." I stood up and turned my back on him. "Detective, do your job." I watched the color drain completely from Preston's face as Detective Reynolds snapped the handcuffs onto his wrists. The metallic click echoed in the silent room, a sound of finality. But I wasn't done. The law would take his freedom, but I needed to take his hope. He still believed somewhere in his panicked mind that the assets existed. He still believed there was a pot of gold at the end of this rainbow, even if he had to go to prison to get it. He thought that maybe, just maybe, after he served his time, he would inherit the empire I built. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I didn't unlock it. I just held it in my hand, tapping it rhythmically against my other palm. "You know, Preston," I said, my voice calm, almost conversational, "there is one more thing. One detail you missed in your meticulous plan to destroy us." Preston looked up at me. His eyes were red, his face streaked with tears and snot. "What?" he croaked. "What detail?" "You were so focused on the death certificate," I continued, pacing slowly around the room. "You were so focused on the power of attorney. You thought if you could just prove I was incompetent and your mother was dead, you would get the keys to the kingdom. You thought this house, this land, these accounts were all just waiting for you to grab them." I stopped in front of the fireplace, looking up at the portrait of my father that hung there. A man who worked in a coal mine so I could go to school. "But you never bothered to check the title of the house, did you?" I asked, turning back to face him. "You never bothered to pull the deed from the county clerk's office. If you had, you would have saved yourself a felony charge." Preston frowned, confusion warring with his fear. "What are you talking about? The house is in your name. I saw the tax records." "You saw the tax bill," I corrected him. "I pay the taxes, but I don't own the house. Not anymore." I took a step closer to him, looming over his kneeling form. 10 years ago, Preston, right after you came to me with your first gambling debt, I realized something painful. I realized that my son was not a builder. He was a wrecking ball. I realized that everything I worked for, everything I sacrificed for, was in danger of being gambled away on a bad hand of poker or a crypto scam. So I did what any good contractor does. I reinforced the foundation. I walked over to the desk and picked up the contract he had just signed. The contract selling the house for $2.8 million. "I went to Harrington 10 years ago," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper, "and we created a legal structure called an irrevocable trust. Do you know what irrevocable means, Preston?" He shook his head, mute. "It means it cannot be changed," I explained. "Not by me, not by you, not by a judge, and certainly not by a fake power of attorney. I transferred the ownership of this house, the land, the investment portfolio, and the entire $5.2 million estate into the Stone Family Heritage Trust." Preston's eyes went wide. But who is the beneficiary? If you die, who gets it?" I smiled. It was a sad smile. "The trust has specific instructions," I said. "The beneficiary was designated as my future grandchildren. The children you and Tiffany might have had if you weren't so busy buying designer shoes and plotting my murder. The money was meant for their education, for their future." I paused, letting the weight of that sink in. "But there is a clause, a safety valve. If there are no grandchildren, or if the direct descendants are deemed unworthy due to criminal activity, then the beneficiary shifts automatically." Preston looked like he was about to be sick. "Shifts to who?" he whispered. I looked at the window toward the view of the city I helped build. The veterans of foreign wars, I said, and the Seattle Children's Hospital. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. That is right, Preston. Even if you hadn't been caught today, even if you had succeeded in selling this house, the sale would have been void. You were selling property that belongs to a trust. You have absolutely no claim to it. You never did. I watched the realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just going to prison. He was going to prison broke. The millions he thought he was inheriting, the safety net he thought he had, were illusions. You mean, Preston stammered, you mean I did all this for nothing? For nothing, I confirmed. You committed fraud for a house you couldn't sell. You killed your mother on paper for insurance money that would have gone straight into the trust account, not your pocket. You destroyed your life for a mirage. Tiffany let out a wail from the corner. She slid down the wall, burying her face in her hands. She knew what this meant. No penthouse, no luxury life, just legal fees and bankruptcy. I looked at my son. I felt a pang of pity, but I crushed it. Pity was what got us here. Pity was the crack in the dam that let the flood in. You thought you were inheriting a fortune? I said, my voice hard as steel. You thought you were entitled to my sweat and my blood. But you forgot that inheritance isn't a right, Preston. It is a privilege, and you just revoked yours. I leaned down close to his ear. You are not inheriting $5 million, son. You are inheriting nothing. No house, no car, no money. The only thing you are inheriting today is the consequences of your own stupidity. I stood up and straightened my jacket. I looked at Detective Reynolds. Take him away, officer. He is trespassing on private property. Property that belongs to the brave men and women who served this country, not to a coward who sells his own mother. Preston looked at me one last time. His eyes were empty. The arrogance was gone. The greed was gone. There was only the hollow look of a man who had gambled his soul and lost. I watched as the detective hauled him to his feet. I watched as they marched him out the front door, past the gray walls he wanted to sell, past the empty spaces where our memories used to be. I didn't follow them. I stayed in the study. I walked over to the desk and picked up the photo of Beatrice and me, the one Tiffany had thrown in the trash bin earlier. I wiped a smudge of dirt off the glass. We were young in the photo, smiling, hopeful. We didn't know then that the hardest thing we would ever build wasn't a skyscraper, but a family. And we didn't know that sometimes the only way to save the foundation is to tear down the rotten parts. I looked at the photo, and then I looked at the empty doorway. Goodbye, son, I whispered. I hope the lesson was worth the price. The room was suddenly filled with the heavy thudding of boots and the crackle of police radios as 4 uniformed officers swarmed into the study. Detective Reynolds stepped back, allowing his team to take control. He pointed a finger at Preston, who was still kneeling on the rug, frozen in a state of shock. Preston Stone, you are under arrest for insurance fraud, forgery, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit murder. Preston didn't fight. He didn't run. He just slumped forward like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The officers grabbed his arms, pulling him roughly to his feet. I watched as they twisted his arms behind his back. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was loud and final. Click, click, click. Then the chaos shifted to the corner of the room. Tiffany, who had been cowering by the window, suddenly realized she was not just an observer. An officer approached her holding another pair of cuffs. Tiffany screamed. It was a high-pitched sound of pure entitlement being shattered. No, don't touch me. I didn't do anything. This is a mistake. Ma'am, you are being detained as an accessory to fraud and conspiracy, the officer said calmly, reaching for her wrist. Tiffany jerked away, her eyes wild. She looked at Preston, and then she looked at me. Her face contorted into a mask of desperate accusation. It was him, she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at her husband. He made me do it. I didn't want to sell the house. I told him it was wrong. He forced me. He said he would leave me if I didn't help him. Preston looked up. His eyes met hers. For years, I had watched them present themselves as the perfect power couple. They were partners in everything. Partners in spending my money. Partners in mocking me behind my back. But now when the ship was sinking, Tiffany was pushing his head under the water to save herself. "You are lying," Preston whispered, his voice hoarse. "You planned the staging. You hired the movers. You picked out the penthouse." "Shut up," Tiffany screamed, struggling against the officer's grip. "You are a loser, Preston. You are a gambling addict and a loser. I should have left you years ago." The officer spun her around and cuffed her. She continued to scream, cursing her husband, cursing the police, and even cursing me for not dying like I was supposed to. I stood by the fireplace, my arm around Beatrice. She was trembling, not from fear, but from a deep, heartbreaking sorrow. She watched as the daughter-in-law she had welcomed into our home, the woman she had tried to love like her own, was dragged toward the door, kicking and screaming. Beatrice buried her face in my shoulder. "Oh, Garrett," she sobbed quietly. "How did we raise him to be like this? Where did we go wrong?" I held her tight. I felt the wetness of her tears soaking into my flannel shirt. I looked at Preston, who was now being led past us. He looked broken. He looked like a child again. The arrogance was gone, stripped away by the cold reality of the law. "We didn't fail him, Beatrice," I whispered into her hair. "We loved him. We gave him everything. We gave him too much. That was our mistake. We protected him from every fall. We paid every debt. We never let him feel the consequences of his actions. Until today." I pulled back slightly and looked into her eyes. I wiped a tear from her cheek with my thumb. "Don't cry for the tumor, Beatrice," I said softly. "Cry because we waited too long to cut it out. But now it is gone, and we can finally heal." Beatrice nodded, wiping her eyes. She straightened her back and took a deep breath. She looked at Preston one last time. Her expression hardened. It was the look of a mother who realizes that tough love is the only love left to give. The officers were moving them toward the hallway. Preston stopped as he passed me. He looked at me with eyes that were hollow and terrified. "Dad," he pleaded one last time. "Dad, what about the Russians? What about the debt? They will kill me in there. You know they have reach." I looked at him. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt a strange sense of peace. The storm was over. The wreckage was severe, but the foundation still stood. I leaned in close to his ear, close enough that only he could hear me over Tiffany's screaming in the hallway. "I don't know about the Russians, son," I said, my voice low and steady, "but I know about prison. It is a hard place, a place where you can't buy your way out, a place where your last name doesn't matter." I paused, letting the words sink in. "In there won't be a daddy to write a check. There won't be a daddy to fix the window you broke. You are on your own, Preston. For the first time in your life, you are completely on your own." I stepped back and looked him in the eye. "Good luck," I said. Preston lowered his head. A single tear rolled off his nose and landed on the expensive Italian leather of his shoe. The officer shoved him forward, and he disappeared into the hallway. I listened as the front door opened and closed. I listened to the sirens wailing outside, fading into the distance. The house was quiet again. But it wasn't the empty, sterile quiet of the staging. It was a heavy, pregnant quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a forest fire when the ground is scorched, but ready for new growth. I looked around the room. The gray walls looked ugly. The modern furniture looked out of place. But the house itself, the beams and the floors and the windows, they were still mine. They were still ours. Beatrice walked over to the window and looked out at the street where the police cars were driving away. She wrapped her arms around herself. "They are gone," she said. "Yes," I said, walking over to stand beside her. "They are gone." She turned to me. "What do we do now, Garrett? This house, it feels tainted." I looked at the walls. I looked at the spot where my recliner used to be. "We clean it," I said. "We strip this gray paint off the walls. We bring back the yellow. We bring back our furniture. We burn that God-forsaken modern chair in the backyard." Beatrice smiled. A small, genuine smile. "And the candy jar?" she asked, pointing to the desk where the golden monstrosity still sat. I walked over and picked it up. I walked to the trash can in the corner of the room. I dropped it in. Thud. "We buy a new one," I said. "A clear one. And we fill it with peppermints. And maybe we get a dog. A rescue. Someone who actually appreciates a warm home." Beatrice laughed. It was a watery laugh, but it was real. "I would like that," she said. I took her hand. It was warm and strong. The hand of a survivor. "Come on," I said. "Let's go get some lunch. I'm starving. And I believe I have $5,000 in cash in my pocket that needs to be spent on a very expensive bottle of wine." We walked out of the study, leaving the broken glass and the torn contracts behind us. We walked out the front door and into the fresh air. The rain had stopped. The sun was breaking through the clouds over Seattle. It was a new day. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly rich. Not because of the money and the trust, but because the parasites were gone and I had my life back. It has been 30 days since the flashing lights of the police cars faded from our driveway. 30 days of meetings with lawyers and 30 days of silence from the county jail. The silence was difficult at first because a father gets used to the noise of his children, even when that noise is destructive. But slowly, the silence changed. It stopped feeling empty and started feeling peaceful. It felt like the quiet after a long shift on a construction site when the jackhammers stop and you can finally hear the birds singing again. Yesterday, we sold the house. This time we didn't use a crooked agent and we didn't sign fake papers. We sold it the right way. We sold it to a young couple from Portland. He is an architect and she is a school teacher. They walked through the front door and they didn't talk about knocking down walls or subdivision rights. They talked about where they would put the Christmas tree. They talked about how the light hit the oak floors in the afternoon. When I shook the young man's hand, I felt a callus on his palm. It was a small thing, but it told me everything I needed to know. This house was going to be in good hands. The check for $2.8 million cleared this morning. It is a lot of money. It is enough money to buy a yacht, or a private island, or that penthouse in Miami that Tiffany wanted so badly. But Beatrice and I don't want a penthouse. We don't want a life of idle luxury. We are builders at heart, and we needed a new project. We drove down to the industrial district in South Seattle this afternoon. There was an old warehouse there that used to be a steel mill. It had been abandoned for years, sitting there with broken windows and weeds growing through the concrete. It looked tired, but the bones were good. The steel beams were straight, and the foundation was solid. We bought it. We are not turning it into condos. We are turning it into the Stone Vocational Center. It will be a school for kids who slipped through the cracks. Kids who don't fit in at university. Kids who like to work with their hands but can't afford the tools. We are going to teach them welding. We are going to teach them carpentry, plumbing, and electrical work. And we are going to do it for free. I stood in the center of that empty, dusty warehouse and I closed my eyes. I could imagine the sound of saws buzzing and sparks flying. I could see a generation of young men and women learning the value of earning $1 instead of stealing it. I realized that this was the legacy I really wanted to leave. I had tried to build a legacy by giving money to my son, and it had rotted him from the inside out. Now I was going to build a legacy by giving opportunity to strangers, and I knew it would stand the test of time. Beatrice squeezed my hand. She was looking at the blueprints we had sketched out on a napkin over lunch. She looked younger than she had in 20 years. The stress lines around her eyes were softening. She wasn't worrying about Preston's debts anymore. She was worrying about what color to paint the lobby of the school. We walked back to the RV parked at the curb. It looked dusty and travel-worn, but to me it looked like a chariot. We climbed inside, and the familiar smell of diesel and old coffee welcomed us home. I sat in the driver's seat and put the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, a deep rumble that vibrated through the soles of my boots. Beatrice opened the glove compartment and pulled out a paper map. We didn't use GPS. We liked the feel of paper and the mystery of the back roads. "Where to?" she asked, tracing a line across the country with her finger. I looked at the map. I looked at the vast web of highways and interstates that stretched from the Pacific to the Atlantic. There were canyons in Arizona we hadn't seen. There were jazz clubs in New Orleans we hadn't visited. There were lobsters in Maine we hadn't tasted. "East," I said. "Let's just drive east until we hit water." I put the rig into gear and pulled away from the curb. I watched the city of Seattle fade in the rearview mirror. I watched the skyline I helped build shrink until it was just a gray smudge against the blue sky. I wasn't leaving my home. I was carrying my home with me. People say that blood is thicker than water. They say that family is everything. I used to believe that. I used to believe that being a father meant sacrificing your own dignity to protect your child. But I learned the hard way that blood is just biology. Loyalty is a choice. Respect is a choice. We lost a son back there in that gray courtroom. I will carry that scar for the rest of my life. I will wake up some nights wondering if I could have done something differently, if I had been stricter, if I had said no sooner. But then I will look at Beatrice sleeping peacefully beside me, and I will know I did the right thing. We cut away the anchor that was dragging us down, and now we are floating. I looked over at Beatrice. She had rolled down the window and was letting the wind blow through her silver hair. She closed her eyes and smiled, face turned toward the sun. She looked free. We are not just two old people in a camper. We are explorers. We are survivors. We are the architects of our own third act. Preston is sitting in a cell right now, staring at four walls and blaming the world for his problems. He is a prisoner of his own greed. I am driving down the highway at 60 miles an hour with the woman I love and a full tank of gas. I gripped the steering wheel and felt the hum of the road. This is what freedom feels like. It doesn't cost $2.8 million. It costs the courage to walk away from what hurts you, even if what hurts you shares your last name. We found our freedom, and this time we are never letting it go. Just last week we swung by the Stone Vocational Center to check on the progress. The smell of ozone and grinding steel hit me the moment I walked in, a perfume better than any expensive cologne. I watched a young man named Diego, a 19-year-old, who used to sleep in his car, perfecting a vertical weld. I had paid for his tuition, his protective gear, and the $400 welding hood he was wearing. When he lifted his mask and saw me, he didn't ask for a handout. He shook my hand with a grip firm enough to crush a walnut and showed me his certification. He had just landed a job starting at $35 an hour. That young man had more dignity in his dirty fingernails than my son ever had in his $3,000 suits. Speaking of Preston, I received a letter from the penitentiary yesterday. He wasn't asking how I was. He wasn't asking about his mother. He was asking if I could deposit $500 into his commissary account, because the prison food was inedible. I folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and tossed it into the campfire we built outside the RV. I watched it turn to ash and float up into the night sky. I don't hate him anymore. I just feel nothing. It is the indifference of a builder looking at a structure that was condemned because the foundation was rotten. You don't mourn the demolition. You just clear the debris and build something better in its place. Beatrice brought me a cup of coffee, black, just how I like it. We sat by the fire listening to the crickets, two millionaires living in a parking lot, richer than we ever were in that big, empty mansion. We realized that the real legacy isn't the check you write when you die. It is the tools you put in someone's hands while you are still alive. This story is a reminder to every parent watching. Love your children, but do not enable them. There is a fine line between supporting a child and crippling them with generosity. I crossed that line, and I paid the price. My son learned to see me as a bank account rather than a human being. If you have a family member who uses you, who manipulates you, and who drains your spirit, you have the right to close the door. You have the right to say no. It might be the hardest thing you ever do, but it might also be the only thing that saves you. Your retirement, your dignity, and your peace of mind are not negotiable assets. Protect them. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us share these important lessons with more people. I want to know what you think. Was I too harsh on Preston, or did he get what he deserved? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below and tell me which city you are watching from. I read every single comment. Thank you for listening, and remember that it is never too late to take back control of your life. See you in the next story.